In May 1942, the Pacific was quiet in a way that never meant safety, and in the first hours after dawn, the American aircraft carrier USS Yorktown was limping eastward across a gray, unsettled sea, smoke still clinging low over the water where bombs had struck her the day before, the ship moving not with confidence but with stubborn momentum, every mile gained feeling provisional because only hours earlier she had been hit, shaken, burned, and nearly slowed to a stop during the Battle of the Coral Sea. And now the question hanging over the task force was simple and brutal. Could she make it back at all, or would the ocean claim her before the war demanded her again? Yorktown had entered the Coral Sea as part of Task Force 17 under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, alongside the carrier Lexington, cruisers, destroyers, oilers, and a scattered screen stretched thin over hundreds of miles of open water. Because in early May, the United States Navy was still learning how to fight a carrier war, still adapting to an enemy who had already demonstrated how quickly air power could decide the fate of fleets. And Yorktown herself was no stranger to risk, having spent the opening months of the Pacific War chasing Japanese raiders, launching strikes, and operating at the extreme edge of American reach. On May 7th, American carrier aircraft had found and sunk the Japanese light carrier Shoho, a moment that briefly lifted morale across the fleet. But the relief was temporary because the next day the Japanese found Yorktown and the battle turned sharply inward, narrowing from a clash of forces to a fight for the survival of individual ships. Japanese dive bombers came down through cloud and flak with trained precision, and when the first bombs struck Yorktown, they did not tear her apart, but they did enough, punching through decks, igniting fires, and momentarily halting her engines, a pause at sea that could be fatal because a stopped carrier was a dead carrier if the enemy returned. Damage control parties moved without drama and without hesitation, sealing compartments, fighting fires, restoring power, because that was what they had trained for. And within an hour, Yorktown was moving again, her speed rising, her flight deck cleared just enough to resume limited operations. But the cost was real, and the ship's ability to fight was diminished, not gone, but narrowed. When Lexington was later hit and ultimately lost, the battle's outcome shifted from tactical exchange to strategic calculation, and Fletcher ordered a withdrawal. Because the mission to stop the Japanese move toward Port Moresby had been achieved, but at the cost of a carrier and with another badly damaged. As Yorktown turned away from the battle area, the ship did not feel victorious. She felt wounded, and the men aboard understood that they were sailing not toward rest, but toward another reckoning, because intelligence from Pearl Harbor was already warning that a larger confrontation was coming, one that would decide the balance of power in the Pacific. The return voyage was therefore not a retreat into safety, but a race against time and uncertainty, with Yorktown's engines straining, her hull compromised, her crew exhausted, and her escort scanning constantly for submarines that would gladly finish what bombs had started. The Pacific in May was deceptive, long swells rolling under a pale sky, visibility shifting with passing squalls, and every hour that passed without attack felt earned rather than given. Below decks, repair crews worked continuously, not to restore the ship to full strength, which was impossible at sea, but to keep systems functional, to reinforce weakened bulkheads, to stabilize what had been shaken loose by explosions, and to ensure that if the ship was hit again, she might survive a second blow. The discipline of these efforts mattered because Yorktown's survival was not just about the ship herself, but about what she represented in the narrow arithmetic of carrier strength, where a single flight deck could decide an entire operation. Radio silence was maintained as much as possible, but fragments of information moved through the command structure, and Fletcher knew that Yorktown would be needed soon, perhaps sooner than anyone wanted to admit, because Japanese carriers were assembling for an operation aimed at Midway Atoll, and the United States could not afford to meet them with fewer decks than necessary. When Yorktown finally reached Pearl Harbor on May 27th, the scene was not one of celebration, but of controlled urgency. Because dockyard assessments quickly made clear what the damage already suggested, that proper repairs would normally take weeks, not days. And yet the calendar did not allow for weeks. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz faced a choice that was not theoretical, but immediate. Either commit Yorktown to the coming battle with only partial repairs, or accept going into a decisive engagement outnumbered. The decision was made without ceremony, because the situation demanded it, and repair crews were assembled in numbers rarely seen, working around the clock, stripping away damaged sections, patching what could be patched, restoring propulsion, communications, and flight deck operations to a level that was not ideal, but usable. For the men aboard Yorktown, the return to Pearl Harbor was not an end, but a transition, because the ship was still in motion even while tied to the pier, time compressing, hours blending together as sleep became secondary to readiness. Aircraft squadrons were reassembled, losses replaced, maintenance accelerated, and within 72 hours, Yorktown was ordered back to sea, her scars still visible, her repairs incomplete, but her presence essential. On May 30, she sailed with Task Force 17 once again, heading north toward a rendezvous with Task Force 16, carrying Enterprise and Hornet, and with them the weight of a strategy that depended on surprise, timing, and the fragile assumption that damaged ships could still fight effectively. As Yorktown cleared Pearl Harbor, the memory of Coral Sea was still fresh, not as a story, but as a condition, a reminder that air attacks could come without warning, that survival could hinge on minutes, and that return was never guaranteed. The transit toward Midway was conducted under strict radio silence, the task forces maneuvering to avoid detection, relying on intelligence estimates that placed the Japanese fleet on a converging course. And for Yorktown, every vibration of the hull, every change in engine note was monitored because the margin for error was thin, and failure would not come as a single dramatic moment, but as an accumulation of small stresses that the ship might not be able to absorb. On June 3rd, reconnaissance confirmed that Japanese forces were approaching Midway, and the American carriers took up their positions. Yorktown assigned a role that acknowledged both her importance and her vulnerability, expected to contribute fully, but also to survive long enough to do so. On the morning of June 4, as the sun rose over a calm sea, Yorktown launched her aircraft into history. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters lifting off in disciplined sequence, each launch a statement that the ship was still operational, still capable, still present. When news came back that American dive bombers had struck Japanese carriers later that morning, the balance of the battle shifted abruptly. But the danger was not over, because surviving Japanese forces still had the ability to strike back, and they did. Mid-morning, Japanese aircraft found Yorktown, and this time the attack was concentrated, deliberate, and unforgiving, with dive bombers pressing home their runs despite anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition. Bombs hit with accuracy, damaging the flight deck, starting fires, and again halting the ship's engines, a repetition of Coral Sea that felt almost cruel in its familiarity. Damage control responded as before, with speed and coordination, restoring power, controlling fires, and bringing the ship back to life. But the cost was cumulative, and the ship's resilience was being tested not as a theory, but as a finite resource. When torpedo planes followed, slipping through the defensive screen, 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown on the port side, flooding compartments, killing power, and giving the ship a severe list that could not be immediately corrected. This time, the damage was beyond quick repair, and the order was given to abandon ship, not as a surrender, but as a recognition that survival now meant preserving lives rather than steel. Yorktown lay still, her list increasing, smoke rising slowly, the sea around her littered with debris and oil, and for hours she remained afloat, stubborn even in apparent defeat, as if refusing to sink on anyone's schedule. American destroyers rescued the crew, and later attempts were made to salvage the carrier, because even then, the possibility of return had not been entirely dismissed. On June 6, as salvage operations continued, the Japanese submarine 168 penetrated the screen and fired torpedoes, one striking Yorktown again, another sinking the destroyer Hammond alongside her. And this final blow removed any remaining doubt. Yorktown sank slowly on June 7, 1942, Her return finally denied, not by bombs alone, but by the accumulated weight of damage, time, and enemy persistence. And yet, the meaning of her journey did not end with her loss, because the fact that she had returned once already and then sailed again into battle had altered the course of the war. In that sense, the return that almost did not happen had already reshaped history, even as the water closed over her hull, and the wider battle at Midway moved toward its own uncertain conclusion, with American forces still exposed, Japanese capabilities not yet fully understood, and the outcome not yet fully secured. With American forces still exposed, Japanese capabilities not yet fully understood, and the outcome not yet fully secured, the hours that followed were marked not by relief but by strain, because even as reports filtered in confirming the destruction of multiple Japanese carriers, commanders at sea could not yet be certain that the enemy had no remaining ability to strike. And in a carrier war, uncertainty was itself a weapon. Task Forces 16 and 17 remained dispersed across a wide expanse of ocean. Fuel levels mattered, aircraft losses mattered, and the sudden absence of Yorktown changed calculations that had already been made under pressure, forcing adjustments in air patrol coverage, search patterns, and defensive screens, because one less flight deck meant fewer fighters in the air and longer gaps between patrol cycles. Admiral Raymond Spruance, now in overall tactical command following Admiral William Halsey's illness, understood that the Japanese might still attempt a counterstroke, either with surviving aircraft or with submarines already known to be operating aggressively in the area. And so the American carriers did not withdraw immediately, but remained alert, their decks cycling aircraft as efficiently as possible under conditions of fatigue and mechanical strain. Enterprise and Hornet had both launched heavy strikes earlier in the day, and their air groups were reduced and scattered, with many aircraft returning low on fuel, some ditching at sea, and others landing on Midway itself, creating a complex recovery problem that had to be solved even as the threat persisted. Pilots who had just returned from combat were briefed again, not to celebrate, but to prepare for further missions, because the battle was not considered finished until the enemy's capacity to interfere with American objectives was eliminated or at least reduced to a level that no longer posed immediate danger. Throughout June 4th and into June 5th, search aircraft were launched repeatedly, their crews scanning empty horizons and scattered wreckage, looking for signs of surviving Japanese ships, and when reports came in, they were often fragmentary, incomplete, and sometimes contradictory, reflecting the fog of war rather than clarity. Among these reports were indications that at least one Japanese carrier, later confirmed as Hiryu, had already been destroyed. But questions remained about the whereabouts of other surface units, including battleships and cruisers that could threaten American carriers if contact were made under unfavorable conditions. The American decision-making process during these hours was cautious but firm, balancing the desire to exploit success against the need to avoid unnecessary risk, because the loss of Yorktown was a reminder that even a single successful enemy attack could have strategic consequences. For the sailors rescued from Yorktown, now distributed among destroyers and other ships, the battle continued in a different form, marked by uncertainty about their ship's fate and their own future assignments, because until Yorktown finally sank, there remained a slim possibility that she could be towed or stabilized, a hope that lingered despite the practical realities. Salvage teams assessed her condition repeatedly, calculating lists, flooding, and structural damage. And while these efforts demonstrated determination, they also consumed time and attention, creating vulnerabilities in the protective screen that the Japanese submarine I-168 would eventually exploit. When that submarine attack occurred on June 6th, striking both Yorktown and Hammond, it underscored how thin the margin still was and how quickly the situation could worsen even after apparent success. Hammond's loss added another layer of complexity, increasing the number of survivors in the water and forcing additional rescue operations under the constant fear of further submarine attacks, because Japanese submarines often lingered, waiting for opportunities created by rescue efforts. The sinking of Yorktown on June 7th finally closed that chapter, but it did not immediately resolve the broader operational questions facing the American fleet, because the carriers still at sea had to decide how long to remain on station. How aggressively to pursue retreating Japanese forces and when to withdraw to safer waters for refueling and reorganization. Fuel consumption had been heavy, destroyers in particular running low as they maintained high-speed screens and conducted frequent maneuvers, and oilers were not immediately available, making logistics a pressing concern that could not be ignored even in the aftermath of victory. Spruance's orders reflected this balance, emphasizing continued vigilance while avoiding overextension, because intelligence estimates suggested that Japanese surface units might still attempt to engage, and the risk of night action, where American carrier aircraft would be less effective, was a serious consideration. Enterprise and Hornet continued to launch search and strike missions on June 5, resulting in the sinking of the heavy cruiser Mikuma and damage to Mogami, actions that further weakened the Japanese force but also exposed American aircraft to intense anti-aircraft fire and fighter opposition, leading to additional losses that reduced air group strength even more. Each loss mattered, not only in numbers but in experience, because early war carrier pilots were still a limited resource, and replacing them would take time that the strategic situation might not allow. As these operations unfolded, communication between ships and higher command remained constrained by the need for radio discipline, meaning that decisions were often made with incomplete information, relying on judgment rather than certainty, a condition that defined naval warfare in the Pacific during this period. For those on Midway Island itself, the battle had also been costly, with airfields damaged, aircraft destroyed, and personnel exhausted. And yet, the island remained operational enough to support search missions and emergency landings, contributing to the overall American effort in ways that were not always immediately visible. The interplay between carrier-based and land-based aviation during these days added another layer of complexity because coordination across different command structures required improvisation under pressure, something that American forces were still learning to do effectively. By June 6th and 7th, as Japanese forces withdrew and American commanders gained greater confidence that the immediate threat had passed, the focus began to shift toward consolidation and assessment. But even then, caution prevailed, because past experience had shown how quickly the situation could change, and because the Pacific theater offered few guarantees. The loss of Yorktown weighed heavily, not only because of the ship herself, but because she represented 1/3 of the American carrier force available at the start of the battle, and her absence would be felt in future operations until new carriers could be brought into service. Nonetheless, the survival of Enterprise and Hornet and the destruction of 4 Japanese fleet carriers marked the turning point that was recognized even at the time, though its full implications would only become clear later. In the immediate aftermath, the American carriers began to withdraw eastward, maintaining readiness but acknowledging the limits imposed by fuel, aircraft losses, and crew fatigue, because prolonged exposure without support would invite unnecessary risk. Destroyers cycled through refueling procedures as efficiently as possible, and flight decks were reorganized, damaged aircraft pushed aside, usable ones serviced, and the air groups reorganized to reflect losses and changing mission requirements. Throughout this process, the discipline and routines of carrier operations continued. Because maintaining normalcy in procedure was itself a form of control in an environment defined by uncertainty. For the men who had survived Yorktown, the transition was abrupt, moving from the identity of a carrier crew to that of survivors awaiting reassignment. Their experiences at Coral Sea and Midway now compressed into memory, even as the war moved on without pause. The broader strategic picture began to solidify as reports were compiled and transmitted, confirming the scale of Japanese losses and the survival of key American assets. But even these confirmations were cautious, because early reports had been wrong before, and assumptions based on incomplete data could be dangerous. As the American fleet moved away from Midway, the immediate tension eased slightly, but the sense of vulnerability remained, because submarines could still strike, aircraft could still appear unexpectedly, and the Pacific offered no natural boundaries to limit the enemy's reach. In this environment, the concept of return took on a broader meaning, extending beyond Yorktown herself to encompass the idea that American forces had not only survived a decisive engagement, but were now beginning to shape the course of the war, rather than merely reacting to it. Yet this shift was fragile, dependent on continued success, effective use of intelligence, and the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy, all of which were challenges rather than guarantees. The days following Midway were therefore not a moment of rest, but a transition into a new phase of the conflict, one in which the United States Navy would have to exploit its advantage while guarding against complacency, because the enemy remained capable, determined, and adaptive. For those who had watched Yorktown sail away from Pearl Harbor only days earlier, still scarred from Coral Sea, her loss was a reminder that even successful returns could be temporary, and that in a war defined by movement and momentum, survival was measured not only by coming back once, but by the ability to keep going when circumstances allowed little margin for error. A reality that continued to shape American decisions as the fleet regrouped and prepared for whatever would come next, with the knowledge that the enemy had been checked but not eliminated, and that the pressure that had defined the return from Coral Sea now gave way to a different kind of strain, one rooted in the responsibility to press an advantage without knowing how long it could be sustained. With the knowledge that the enemy had been checked but not eliminated, and that the pressure that had defined the return from Coral Sea now gave way to a different kind of strain, one rooted in the responsibility to press an advantage without knowing how long it could be sustained, the American fleet moved into a phase where danger became less visible but no less real, because the most catastrophic failures in naval warfare often came not at the height of battle, but in the uncertain hours after, when assumptions replaced confirmation and exhaustion dulled judgment. Admiral Spruance understood that despite the destruction inflicted at Midway, Japanese naval doctrine emphasized counteraction, and submarines, long-range reconnaissance, and surface forces could still impose losses that might blunt the strategic outcome. So every movement was calculated, every course change deliberate, and every hour at sea weighed against fuel consumption and readiness. Enterprise and Hornet were no longer operating at full strength, their air groups reduced by combat losses, mechanical failures, and aircraft scattered across Midway or lost to ditching, and this reduction meant that combat air patrols had to be rationed carefully, with fewer fighters covering wider arcs, increasing the risk that an enemy aircraft or submarine might penetrate the screen. Destroyer commanders, already strained by continuous maneuvering and limited rest, remained on constant alert, sonar operators listening intently for contacts that might indicate a submerged threat, knowing that a single torpedo could alter the balance that had just been achieved. Reports from patrol aircraft continued to arrive, some suggesting distant contacts, others disproven upon closer inspection, and each report forced commanders to decide whether to pursue, hold position, or withdraw, decisions made with incomplete information and the awareness that misjudgment could be irreversible. The Pacific remained vast and indifferent, offering no clear markers to distinguish safety from exposure, and the fleet's formation reflected this uncertainty, spreading enough to reduce vulnerability but remaining close enough to provide mutual support. Within this environment, fatigue became a silent adversary as flight deck crews worked extended shifts, maintenance teams addressed battle damage under time pressure, and command staff processed a constant flow of intelligence updates. Because complacency could invite disaster. At the same time, the strategic imperative to confirm Japanese withdrawal compelled American commanders to continue search operations, despite the risks, because an unchallenged enemy force could regroup and strike elsewhere, undermining the gains achieved at Midway. This tension between caution and pursuit defined the near-failure phase of the operation, as the fleet balanced on the edge between consolidation and overreach. On June 6, additional strikes against Japanese surface units, including cruisers attempting to withdraw, were authorized, reflecting a decision to exploit success while conditions allowed. But these strikes came at a cost, exposing American aircraft to concentrated anti-aircraft fire and increasing the likelihood of losses that could not be easily replaced. The sinking of Mikuma and damage to Mogami demonstrated tactical success, but the price paid in aircraft and aircrew underscored how thin American margins remained, reinforcing the reality that victory at Midway did not eliminate risk, but redistributed it. Communication challenges persisted, with radio silence limiting the speed and clarity of information flow, and reliance on encoded transmissions introducing delays that sometimes rendered reports outdated by the time they were received. This lag forced commanders to rely heavily on judgment and experience, qualities that varied among individuals and were tested relentlessly under these conditions. The potential for miscalculation loomed, particularly if Japanese forces attempted a night engagement, where American carrier aviation would be less effective and surface combat capabilities might be tested against an enemy skilled in nocturnal operations. Awareness of this possibility influenced American movements, encouraging withdrawal from areas where night contact might occur, even if it meant relinquishing opportunities for further strikes. Fuel constraints added another layer of risk as destroyers approached critical levels, and carriers had to consider the timing of refueling operations, which themselves created vulnerabilities by limiting maneuverability and concentrating ships. The logistics of refueling at sea were complex and hazardous, requiring precise coordination and calm seas, conditions that could not be guaranteed, and any disruption during these operations could expose the fleet to attack. Within this context, the idea of near failure was not hypothetical but tangible, because a single successful enemy submarine attack during refueling or a surprise night surface action could have inflicted losses severe enough to offset the strategic gains of Midway. The men aboard Enterprise and Hornet were aware of these risks, even if not all details were shared, because the tempo of operations, the constant readiness, and the visible absence of Yorktown communicated the seriousness of the situation without words. For many, the realization set in that survival thus far did not guarantee survival tomorrow, and that the war's direction could still pivot on events unfolding in the next hours or days. Intelligence estimates gradually began to indicate that Japanese forces were withdrawing in earnest, but confirmation required continued observation. And until that confirmation was solid, American commanders could not fully relax their posture. As June 7th approached, the fleet's operational state reflected a delicate equilibrium, with vigilance sustained but pressure mounting, and the cumulative strain pushing personnel and equipment toward their limits. The Pacific weather remained variable, with shifting cloud cover and sea states that could complicate flight operations or conceal enemy movements, adding unpredictability to an already complex situation. Amid this uncertainty, the American fleet's ability to maintain cohesion and discipline became a decisive factor, because fragmentation or confusion could magnify risks and invite exploitation by an adaptive enemy. The near-failure phase was therefore defined not by a single dramatic incident, but by an extended period in which the margin between success and setback narrowed, and the outcome depended on sustained performance under conditions that offered little room for recovery. As the fleet prepared to adjust its posture based on emerging intelligence, the sense persisted that the decisive turning point had not yet fully resolved, and that the next set of decisions would determine whether the gains achieved at such cost would hold, or whether the absence of Yorktown and the accumulated strain would finally tip the balance in a way that no one aboard could yet foresee. Or whether the absence of Yorktown and the accumulated strain would finally tip the balance in a way that no one aboard could yet foresee. And it was within this narrowing window that the operational reality of Midway finally began to settle into something recognizable, not as certainty, but as direction. Because by June 7th, the pattern of Japanese withdrawal became consistent across multiple intelligence sources. Aerial reconnaissance no longer finding organized carrier formations advancing eastward, but instead scattered surface units moving west and northwest, away from Midway and away from contact. Admiral Spruance weighed this information carefully, understanding that overcommitment in pursuit could expose his remaining carriers to exactly the kind of attritional loss that the Japanese hoped for. And so he made the decision that would define the end of the battle: choosing preservation of force over aggressive chase. Not because opportunity was absent, but because the strategic value of survival now outweighed the uncertain benefits of continued engagement. This decision marked the moment when Midway transitioned from active combat to operational aftermath, a shift that did not feel dramatic aboard ship but was nonetheless decisive, as flight operations gradually shifted from strike preparation to recovery, reorganization, and extended reconnaissance aimed more at confirmation than engagement. Enterprise and Hornet adjusted course eastward, maintaining anti-submarine vigilance but reducing the tempo of air operations as fuel conservation became paramount, because sustaining combat readiness for future operations mattered more than marginal gains against a retreating enemy. Destroyers rotated positions to manage fuel and fatigue, and refueling operations were conducted as conditions allowed, restoring a measure of flexibility that had been dangerously constrained during the height of the battle. As the immediate threat receded, damage assessments became more thorough, revealing the cumulative wear sustained by ships and aircraft, damage that had been temporarily tolerated under combat conditions but now required attention to ensure long-term effectiveness. Aircraft losses were tallied with greater accuracy, revealing not just numbers, but gaps in squadron strength that would shape upcoming deployments, and pilots who had survived multiple sorties in rapid succession or finally stood down long enough to rest, though the mental imprint of the battle lingered. Reports were compiled and transmitted to Pearl Harbor, and from there to Washington, confirming the destruction of 4 Japanese fleet carriers and the loss of Yorktown, a balance that fundamentally altered the naval equation in the Pacific, even if its implications were not yet fully articulated. For the men who had served aboard Yorktown, now dispersed across other ships or returned to shore facilities, the finality of her loss settled in gradually, replacing earlier uncertainty with a quiet understanding that their ship's role had ended, not at Coral Sea, and not even at the moment she was abandoned, but only when she slipped beneath the surface days later, after giving everything she could to the battle that followed. This realization carried weight because Yorktown's return from Coral Sea had not been a footnote, but a prerequisite for Midway itself. And without that damaged carrier sailing again, the American position on June 4th would have been significantly weaker, perhaps fatally so. Within the fleet, this understanding did not translate into celebration or rhetoric, but into a sober acknowledgement of how narrow the margin had been, and how much the outcome depended on decisions made under pressure, repair work completed under impossible timelines, and crews who operated damaged equipment as if it were whole because the situation demanded nothing less. As Task Forces 16 and 17 continued their withdrawal, the Pacific resumed its vast stillness, broken only by the routine sounds of engines, flight deck operations, and watches changing. And yet, the psychological landscape had shifted, because for the first time since December 1941, American naval forces had not merely survived a major engagement, but had emerged with a clear strategic advantage. This advantage, however, was understood as temporary unless reinforced, because intelligence assessments emphasized that Japanese shipbuilding, training pipelines, and remaining surface forces still posed a serious threat, and that the loss of experienced Japanese carrier air crews, while significant, would not immediately end their operational capability. Nonetheless, the immediate effect was undeniable, as Japanese plans for further expansion in the Central Pacific were disrupted, forcing a reassessment that would ripple outward into subsequent campaigns. Midway became a reference point within the fleet, not because of speeches or declarations, but because operational planning from that moment forward assumed a different balance of initiative, one in which American forces could begin to shape engagements rather than simply respond to them. The carriers that survived Midway returned to Pearl Harbor not as symbols, but as tools still very much in use, requiring refit, reinforcement, and integration into a growing fleet that would soon include new Essex-class carriers designed for exactly the kind of sustained operations that early warships like Yorktown had been forced to conduct with limited support. As these preparations unfolded, the lessons of Yorktown's near return and final loss were absorbed into doctrine and training, influencing damage control procedures, repair prioritization, and operational risk assessment in ways that would save lives and ships later in the war. The emphasis on rapid repair, flexible deployment, and the willingness to commit damaged assets when strategic necessity demanded it became part of the institutional memory of the Navy, shaped not by theory but by experience. For historians, the sequence of events linking Coral Sea to Midway forms a continuous narrative, but for those who lived it, the connection was immediate and visceral.
Because there had been no pause between battles, no opportunity to reset expectations or recover fully, only a constant forward motion driven by necessity. Yorktown's story, therefore, does not end solely with her sinking, but with the operational continuity she enabled. A continuity that allowed American forces to meet the Japanese fleet at Midway with enough strength to prevail. By the time the fleet dispersed to refuel, refit, and prepare for future operations, the immediate danger had passed, and the battle's outcome was secure, not because every threat had been eliminated, but because the conditions that allowed the Japanese to dominate the early months of the Pacific War no longer existed in the same form. The return that almost did not happen had fulfilled its purpose, not by ensuring Yorktown's survival, but by enabling a moment where survival itself became strategic leverage. And as the Pacific Campaign moved inexorably toward Guadalcanal and beyond, the legacy of those days in May and June 1942 remained embedded in every subsequent decision. A quiet reminder that in carrier warfare, the line between loss and lasting impact was often defined not by whether a ship returned home, but by whether it returned when it mattered most.